The goal of GameFeel is to make the game a rewarding experience for your player. To make the basic interactions of your game feel polished, responsive, and immersive, and improve the quality of feedback that is presented to the player. In this video, Artindi and I will be giving you some tips that we think can improve the feel of your game. Howdy, and welcome to Game Endeavor. Learn practical dev skills and improve the quality of your games by subscribing and ding-a-ling that bell. This is a collaboration for Artindi's 10 Tips series, so after you've watched this video and are desperately craving more content, we also have a 10 Tips video for using the AnimationPlayer in Godot on Artindi's channel. There's a link in the description. The first tip we have for you is very simple but will be a massive improvement to your games, and that's to use tweening and easing wherever possible. If you're not aware of what tweening is, it's just a fancy way of interpolating one numeric value to another, such as the scale of a slime when it's about to pounce, the up and down movement of a platformer character's animation, or even the motion of a moving platform as it moves from one position to another. Linear interpolation is generally very bland and feels too mechanical, but if you toss in some fancy easings, then you can really make your game pop.
You don't ever want to frustrate the player unnecessarily, and something that can be very frustrating is hitboxes colliding or not colliding when the player thinks or feels like they should or shouldn't. Try making the player's hitbox just a tad smaller, enemy hitboxes just a tad bigger, and hazards like spikes also just a tad smaller. Basically, make sure that if collisions happen or don't happen, the player never thinks it was a glitch or a fluke.
Adjusting your engine's timescale can really help to sell the impacts in your game, and if done well, then your player doesn't even have to notice them, but it will still emphasize important moments in your game, such as when your player executes a powerful attack, or making enemies seem threatening when they cause damage to your player.
Because computers are super accurate, and because the logic of most games says you can only jump when touching the ground, players can get frustrated when nothing happens, when they hit the jump button just 1 pixel away from the ground, or just 1 pixel too late when at the edge of a platform. So it is a good idea to add a jump buffer, something that remembers the jump button was pushed, but only for about 1/10 of a second, so that in this case, the player will feel like they have perfect timing. And it is a good idea to add something called coyote time, another timer that would allow the player to jump after leaving a platform, but only within about 1/10 of a second as well. Don't worry, with a time that small, players will never even notice, but you will increase the window in which they can nail that perfect jump, and make sure that if they miss the timing, they can only blame themselves rather than your game.
Shaders are often used to make games look modern and overall improve their visual aesthetic, but they can also be used to provide visual feedback to the player. For example, you can use a shader to flash an entity whenever it takes damage. This lets your player know that damage has occurred. You can also desaturate the screen whenever the player takes damage. This is especially powerful if your game has a dark and gloomy aesthetic. You could even adjust the outline of the objects in your game based on whether or not the player can interact with them currently.
Anytime the player pushes a button to make something happen, make it happen instantly. There are very few cases where you wouldn't want the player's input to be instantaneous. But not just that. Adjust little things like how quickly the characters speed up, or gravity, or whatever else it takes to make the player feel like they are in complete control. I recommend letting many people try out the controls before you even make the rest of your game. Take their feedback and keep adjusting till you have it absolutely perfect.
If you've ever played a game without music or sound effects, then you know how awkward this is. Music is often overlooked when developing games, but it's one of the most critical elements that set the tone for your game. You can uplift the player's mood and make them feel bright and cheery just like the elements in your game, or you can get their heart pumping, narrow their focus, and make it feel as though they're slicing through an army of orcs to rescue a group of townsfolk. Always think about how you want your player to feel emotionally, and use music and sound effects to achieve this.
Give the player as much feedback as possible. Make sure they are immersed in your game. Most people call this game juice, and there are many tutorials out there for it. You can make a dull game feel exciting with good player feedback. And even if your game is supposed to be a more relaxed kind of game, the right player feedback will still be needed to immerse your player in the game. Remember, game feel is more than just drawing explosions and stuff. It's about all the senses, so use everything you can to make the player feel like they are actually there.
If you've ever played an RPG, then you know how bad this next tip feels. Avoid randomness that your player has absolutely no control over and no way of interacting with. Things like random mischances, random speech fails, or selecting a hidden power-up randomly. These generally are not fun for the player, Instead, try to focus on more randomness that your player can participate in, like procedural map generation, random events that shake up the previously non-chaotic gameplay, or choose one power-up from a list that is generated and fully visible to the player.
When planning your game and the levels in your game, avoid any mechanics that are confusing or overly complicated. People like simple mechanics that are easy to understand and are simple enough to execute on a basic level. Also, try to make goals and objectives clear. For example, if there is some kind of timer in your game, make sure the player knows it. Or if the player is supposed to get to a door at the end of each level, make sure the door is obviously the objective, and stay consistent with its design. You want the player to focus on playing your game, rather than figuring out how to play your game.
If you implement these tips into your game, then you will notice a drastic improvement for how it feels to your player. And remember to watch Artindi's video where we give you some tips for using Godot's AnimationPlayer. And if you're new, then join the subclub to get notified for future videos.